covering how to choose a lamp burner for your antique lamp. You might be curious on choosing the burner and chimney for your antique lamp. Most of these lamps now is run on kerosene. So we're going to get into how to choose what type of burner you may want. First of all, you want to know the style and the era that your lamp came from. You may have an earlier style. This goes back to 1850s all the way up to the 1860s. Then these would be 1870s up to around 1890. And this would be your early 1870 number 2 burner. These are a number 1 or a 00. You can put a 00 or a number 1 in these. Now this is your number 2 style. This would start around 1870. Waterbury would start making number 2 burners. And then this would be your 1920s, 30s, up to the 40s style lamp. It would be screwed into the inside of the glass with the ring made into the glass. It won't have your antique collar on the top of it. So you may be wondering what kind of burner to get. Different time periods and different eras. These burners was all different from different eras. The lamps was originally sold without burners. So if you went to a hardware store, you might pick out a lamp and you may think, you may buy a lamp and then you want to buy a burner. Well, whatever hardware store you was at, you would go through all the different boxes and pick what type of lamp burner that was available at the time. But now, as the time progressed, people would keep the lamp base and change the burners just like modern day light bulbs. The burners would be changed and updated over the years. I usually like to find a lamp and match it with a burner that's the same era, but that's not actually, you don't have to have it that way, because they actually upgraded these burners over the years as people used them. Now, as houses changed, these burners would change with the style of house. Now, back in the 1850s and way back when they was burning animal fats and whale oil, the liquid would be very thick in some of these seed oils, and the house would be very ventilated back then. There wouldn't be no insulation, and the roofs would be a lot taller, the ceilings would be much higher, so the rooms would stay anywhere between 32 and up to 50 degrees in the wintertime, so it stayed very cold in the older houses, and there was a draft blowing through the house. So the burners on these older lamps, they would choose a burner that would burn much hotter. So you would have a summer burner for the summer when the months was really warm, and then you would have a winter burner that would burn more efficiently when it was cold. The homes didn't have no heating other than just a fireplace, and the room stayed extremely cold. Now, if you watch some of the movies from the 1930s, 20s, and 30s, Christmas carols, and some of the old Scrooge movies, maybe even watch some of the old Frankenstein movies and stuff from the 20s and 30s, you'll see in the old mansions it was very cold. People wore a lot of clothes. A lot of times they had house coats, wardrobes that was very thick. A lot of times people wore a lot of clothes when they even slept at night. They even had night caps to keep their heads warm. They had a lot of bed clothing on their beds, and the houses was either rock or wood. Most of the time they were really cold, and so they had to have a burner that would stay warm enough to burn the liquids that they had at the time. Now, kerosene is more modern than what they had then. back then they was using animal fats and seed oils and other types of oils. They didn't have the technology for kerosene. Kerosene didn't start coming around until the 1860s, 1870s. It was still kind of new, but most of the first oils was seed or animal fats, and then they had a what they called coal oil, and that was from crushing coal and extracting oils out of coal. Now it was a much different from kerosene. Kerosene is a liquid that came directly out of just regular oil out of the earth. Now the coal oils, they were extracted from petrified uh, plants and animals. It was in coal, so it was very hard, and the Germans was the ones that started learning how to crush coal and getting the oils extracted and making gasoline and coal oil and kerosene from that. But later on they would start refining the just regular liquids. Um, this would be what you would call a winter burner. You can see it keeps stepping up, and the inside underneath this cap is very small with very small holes, so there's not a whole lot of air coming up through it. And when you get to this is your early Eagle style burner. It has a little bit bigger cap around it with a little bit more holes in it. You can see it's got a flatter base, so as the air comes down it whirls around and keeps it cool and pulls it up. Now also you want to look at the tops of these. Tops of these openings will determine how much airflow goes through. Sometimes these can be too small, sometimes they can be too large. The smaller ones, the heat will come down and it will circle around in a circle, and it'll make a whirling motion, and as the heat's coming down and coming back up, it will heat this brass base, and then it'll heat all the way down to the collar. And when you feel the collar like this, you will feel the collar is warm. Now if you got a house and you're keeping it above 50 degrees, you don't want to run one of these winter burners. Now if you have a Victorian house and it stays real cold inside, and you got temperatures down in the 30s, 40s, very low 50s, then you could probably run one of these winter burners. Or if you're outdoors or in a cabin or something where you've only got a fireplace, it stays kind of cool, you want to use these burners in degrees under 50, because they get really warm. They get warm down here in the collar too. Now if you got a warm house or it's summertime, these will get scalding hot. This right here will get hot. Now if it gets too hot, you can crack the glass, and you can cause the putty ring that's underneath here that holds this collar on, it will crack and start falling out. You can also cause damage to the brass burner. The burner itself, the cap will start cooking, the brass will start turning red, and it'll start charcoaling the brass, and the brass will turn a real dark black, and it will actually burn the brass. Some of these, it's kind of irreversible once you get to burning them down like that, so you want to keep these lamps burning in the winter time when it's really cold. You don't want to get these lamps real hot, because it will damage your lamp and it will destroy your burner. Now if it's summertime, you can use a burner like this. It'll work in summer degrees, 50s, 60s, 70s. I wouldn't want to get over the 70s if you're using a house that's got a real good heater in it and it's real well insulated. You want to keep your temperatures low, because it can get hot. It usually don't. It usually stays pretty warm, unless if the temperatures get really hot, like 80 and 100 degrees. Sometimes in summertime, the old people wouldn't even run their lamps. They would run a candle in the summertime, because they were afraid of damaging their burners or cracking the glass or messing up the collars. So you got to think about that. If you're using a bigger style lamp, this is an 1870 style. It's a number 2. This is a Waterbury style burner. Now Waterbury actually put vent holes in the bottom of some of these, and it did help do away with the sweat in the glass, because these, as they start up, the glass will sweat around the bottom right here. This helps get the moisture out from the glass, but it doesn't do a whole lot to cool the lamp. It just helps to rid the lamp of moisture. But now, if you're using a tall burner like this in the wintertime, you want to use it when it's really cold. The house is cold inside. But now if you're running a summer burner, these will also fit on your more modern lamps. It was made up all the way up into the 30s, 40s. They would use those. But you also want to make sure that the top is a good size. You want to make sure the top of the ring here is around the same diameter as the little cap that snaps down. You want a good size opening, because if the opening is too small, you will get a lot of heat right here. It'll back the heat up down here, so you're not pulling the heat out. Now you'll find these flared tops, they work really well because it will pinch it up, but it'll let it back out, and it won't hold it too much. They seem to run a little bit cooler. But you'll want to try to find a burner that matches your lamp. There is different colors and there is different makers. Now there is oil lamps that comes out of Canada, some that comes out of the UK, and other countries that is found in the US. People's brought them here. And you want to try to find the maker of the lamp by the collar. Once you identify the maker of the lamp by the collar, usually the collar will identify the lamp. Once you find the maker, then you want to go with a style of burner that will fit the collar, because a lot of these lamps, if they're made outside of the United States, and there was even some made in the United States around 1910, 1912, that had this style where the lamp burner screws into the glass. Now some of these that screws into the glass, there's all different sizes. There's even number 3 burners. Some of these burners will have different threads and they will not interchange. So you'll have to match some of these lamps up with the manufacturer. Whatever the manufacturer was, you'll have to find the same kind of burner. Now, some of these lamps that come from Atterbury, and some of the lamps that was manufactured up in Connecticut and Massachusetts, there was a lot of manufacturers in the New England states. Atterbury was one of the most popular, but you all also find, like, I believe they call it Riverside. Now this was a Virginia manufacturer up in Virginia, and this is what a Riverside collar looks like. You can find a Riverside collar on a lot of them. They were manufactured in Virginia. They will also accept a lot of Plume and Atwood burners. Riverside will. But there was a lot of manufacturers that made a lot of lamps that had different size collars and different size burners that was a lot different from the normal burners that was being sold at the time. So if you got a lamp and you don't really know much about it, when you light it up, you want to feel the collar. Stick your fingers in between, feel the collar, and make sure it's not hot. Now it may be warm to the touch, that's alright as long as it's warm. But now if it's hot enough to where you can't stand to touch it, then you want to either change your burner or change your chimney. The top may be too small here, the opening. But if you have a winter burner, it will stand real tall and it will have a very small cap with very few holes in it. Now, the winter burner, you may want to change it out and go with something like an eagle burner, a Plume Atwood eagle burner. That was a very famous burner. It fit most lamps. It was very popular amongst the old people, and it was pretty interchangeable, widely interchangeable. They made number ones, they made number twos, and they made double zeros in these. So they made a wide variety of these. Now, these burners would come out somewhere around 1880, 1890. You would see them mostly through the 1900s. General Electric would buy out Plume Atwood. Plume Atwood would get their technology from Waterbury. When the Waterbury manufacturer changed hands, Plume Atwood used to work at Waterbury, so the two men would acquire the factory and start the Plume Atwood factory from the old Waterbury factory. So the Waterbury burners would predate Plume Atwood because they were still working at the factory at the time and they hadn't really switched over. Now, there was a period when they were transitioning from Waterbury to Plume Atwood, and they were still working in the factory, but they were going through the transition of acquiring the factory. So sometimes you may find some that's Plume Atwood, but they date the same time as Waterbury. But after Plume Atwood bought them out and started manufacturing lamps, then you would see GE come in. GE, General Electrics, would come in. They would want to do away with kerosene lamps, coal lamps. They would want to do away with it because they were promoting electricity. Now, electricity and coal was in a huge competition. Even though the light bulb dates way back to the early 1800s, people still didn't want to change to electric. Electric had to be wired into their homes. A lot of people didn't want wiring in their homes in those times. People didn't understand wiring. They didn't understand electricity. Another thing is old people could pick up their lamps, carry them to any table, and sit down. Now, if you had an electric lamp, you would have to unplug it. You'd have to find another plug in. And if your house wasn't wired for another plug in, then you would have a problem trying to find the way to light the room. So a lot of people stayed with kerosene and coal lights up until the 1960s. Well, GE had no way of doing away with the kerosene lamps, and they were losing a lot of money because GE was wanting to hurry and make everybody switch to electric lamps. So when GE eventually bought out Plume Atwood, GE would take Plume Atwood's eagle burners and they would start finding ways to convert them to electric light bulbs. And this is how they eventually phased out kerosene lamps. Now, sometimes you will find some of these early burners that was converted, and this was during the era when General Electric would buy out Plume Atwood. And they would take the leftover stock of eagle burners and they would equip them with an electric insert. Take them apart. This one still got the original price tag of $3 when it was new. Somebody had never used it. They'd probably kept it around, but they probably was still using kerosene in their home at the time. But this was a new one. It's never been used. But they would slowly get people to transition to electricity. It was very hard for them to get people to transition because it was expensive. No one wanted to pay electricity, and they didn't want to pay nobody to wire their home. In a Victorian home that had never been wired, it was fairly costly to have a home tore apart and wiring put in it. So a lot of people tried to stay with their old lamps. A lot of people ran them up into the 60s. Some homes didn't get electricity in them until sometimes all the way up until almost the 1970s. In some of these rural areas, a lot of people enjoyed using their oil lamps because they could just pick them up and move them anywhere they wanted them. And that is how the burners evolved over the years. Now, I don't have a well oil burner. They're a little pricey, and I think they're a little bit overpriced, but a well oil burner was basically just two prongs with a candle wicks inside of it that would burn. They quickly phased those out when they started coming out with the safety burners. These is what the old people would call a safety burner because they were safe underneath here. There wouldn't be no way for it to catch on fire. They capped off everything, sealed everything up, put a glass shade on it. No bugs, no curtains, nothing could fly into the flame. So the lamp was a safety feature. That was what they called a safety lamp when they started transitioning over. So that was a big feature. Now some of these lamps, you will see them with a really tall chimney. The taller the chimney, the more pull you will get. It's just like a fireplace. The taller the chimney, the more pull it will have, the faster it will pull the flame. The shorter the chimney, the slower it pulls the flame. So sometimes if you've got a lamp that's burning a little bit too hot, sometimes you can put a taller chimney on it. It'll pull air quicker up. But the old people would just basically play with the knowledge of what they knowed on these lamps as they upgraded them over time. Hardware stores would sell everything individually, so a lot of people today may think that these lamps all came together. A lot of times these lamps didn't. Sometimes the hardware stores would put the lamps together and sell them as a whole, but they were shipped separately by the different manufacturers. The shades would be manufactured by a different company, the burners would be different, and the lamp base would be different. So, and a lot of manufacturers would try to incorporate their lamps and their burners and their chimneys to interchange. But now some didn't. Some had their own burners and some had their own chimneys and their own bases. And they were usually sold together, but you didn't see this start coming around until 1909, 1910, and then you would see it kind of hit its peak around 1912. They would start making very big, large lamps with number 2 burners, and they would put the burner chimney on the lamp and sell it all together. These lamps would be more toward the 1900s. You wouldn't see anything like that in the 1800s. But your more expensiver lamps, they would be universal. They would be able to interchange burners, chimneys. But there was a lot of change in these. So if you get one, you may have to play with it and find out who the manufacturer was and what type of burner that you want to put on it and what type of burner will fit it. Sometimes not all burners will interchange. You also want to know the manufacturer, what country it came from. Some of these will be different. They would come from different countries. Miller made a lot of burners and made a lot of lamps. They were a very old lamp company. I don't have one of these style of lamps or burners, but you will find them. I'm not sure the thread types or the type of collar Miller used, but there were different manufacturers. So when you go to look for a lamp and you want to put one together, You may buy the base separate from the burner and the chimney. You might buy it that way, or you might buy it together. But if you buy it together, you may want to look at the type of burner. Now, if these lamps come from somewhere up cold in the New England states, or up in Minnesota, or somewhere around the border of Canada, you will find a lot of these winter burners. It got very cold up there. A lot of people needed a winter burner. But now, if you're down in the southern states, you will find these flat style eagle burners. These was very popular as you started getting down from Virginia down to Florida. You would start finding eagle burners. Now, if you get into some of the northern states, you will find something like this Plume and Atwood Globe burner. You may even find some of these Waterbury burners. But now some of the northern states use some of these eagle burners in the summer. But most of your winter burners is a lot more common in the northern states where it's a lot colder. But they are found in the southern states because it did get cold in the southern states. But you have to think about the type of lamp, the size collar, the size burner. Are you going to be running it in the wintertime? Are you going to be running it in the summertime? What's the temperatures? What type of shade you want to put on it? Chimney. There's a whole lot of different things you got to look at when putting together a lamp. There's a lot of questions about lamps because the technology is far gone. A lot of people don't know nothing about lamps now. The old people is done dead that knowed all this technology. My grandparents, they grew up during the brass era, Brass Valley. They remembered all the brass river boats. They were very old. So I picked up a lot of what they knowed about it, and they taught me. And they used to change the burners out, change the lamps out, and they would change the fluids. And I learned as a kid by watching them and how they done it. Nowadays, a lot of people don't know a whole lot about these style of lamps. There's very little bit known. There is a few books here and there that tell some history on it. But a lot of it is lost. That's the basics that I know on it. If there's anything else that I might not have covered and someone else knows more, share it in the comments. Maybe someone might find that interesting. But that is all the knowledge that I know that I was taught on these lamps. So maybe this will help someone that's trying to understand their coil lamps and how to put them together, how to make them the way they want them. Now, if you want to go to an electric lamp, they still make these. They make them today. You can even find old ones like this and put light bulbs in them. So if you want to electrify them, this is the way to go. It doesn't hurt the lamp. You just simply screw it in. But you do have a cord, and you do have to find a plug in. So you can't move the lamp. It has to be fixed wherever the plug-in's at. But you can electrify it if you want to electrify it. I usually use kerosene. I live in an older house. It stays cold. Kerosene works. But it all depends on the type of house, the way you want to run it. I like the old style illumination that fire gives off. You get a warm light. You also get a little bit of warm heat. So if you got a Victorian house that's got a lot of draft to it and got a lot of cold temperatures to it, you can use a lot of these lamps and it's fine. Now, some of the really old homes, you can tell how old the house is by the height of the ceiling. The ceiling's really high. You're got a really high ceiling. That ceiling was made to catch smoke. So if you was running a lot of oil lamps, burning a lot of candles, and you had a fireplace going and there was a lot of excess smoke, that was the extra room for the smoke to settle at the ceiling. So if you have an old house that has a very tall ceiling and you're trying to figure out why it has a very tall ceiling and it's not normal height like a modern house, that is why. The smoke will go up, it'll settle. They made the rooms high enough to where the smoke had enough room off of all the lamps and fire to settle at the top. And the smoke would settle above the door facing on up, and then it would eventually vent itself out, and this would keep the smoke out of people's faces. So if you have an older home with a very high ceiling, you can use a lot of candles, a lot of coil lamps, and burn fireplaces. That was a big thing in the old days. So maybe some of this knowledge, you can learn a few things on some of it. If you're looking to get into older lighting, maybe this will help.